Hello everyone, and recently we saw the release of the Warhammer Classic, so a bunch of video games re-released onto Steam and getting a few updates here and there. Nothing major, but making them playable on more modern machines, which is absolutely amazing because as your machines get more and more complex, unfortunately, the earlier titles just wouldn't work, and that's a massive shame. So it's good to see that happening, especially with a game like this. Mark of Chaos is an amazing title. People call this title Total War Warhammer before Total War Warhammer. I instead called it more like Battle for Middle-earth, the original one, or even Praetorian. More so like Praetorian. But this is the game that many, including myself, which helped us get a new profound love for Warhammer Fantasy. And not only that, if you're a fan of Warhammer the Old World or need a reason to be excited for Warhammer the Old World, this is set just after. You see, there is quite a lot coming in here. There's a expansion, they're both together, and you've got the Empire, the Orcs and Goblins, but the Hordes of Chaos is the main reason why I love this game. So the campaigns were scripted, but the idea here is you would progress through your campaign, sometimes there'd be divergences, and there were elements of choice, especially with the Chaos one, where you could choose where to devote yourself. You had two options. There would be different story elements, which would mean that you could see your push going on with the Warriors of Chaos, but then divert a little bit to the Skaven. And story-wise, this was set after the Great War against Chaos. So, for those not aware, the Warhammer the Old World setting right now, the Return of Warhammer Fantasy, is based on the Great War. So this is going to be a video game, oddly enough, that was created so long ago, based a little bit after that. It's wild, actually. But it's going to give you the context of what more or less happened and what destruction came. And it shows that even after a great war, 200 years before the age of Karl Franz, things didn't slow down. There were still war bands coming up, there were still Chaos Lords arising, and so much more. The controls are a little jank, but this is a 20-plus-year-old game, so it's kind of expected. But even then, combat was satisfying, and there was quite a lot going into it. I really adored this title, and yes, this title is what brought me closer to Warhammer Fantasy. I was already playing Warhammer Fantasy, I'd already been building up armies, but it's amazing what video games can actually do to get you closer to a setting. Now you might be wondering, well, if this game was so good, why didn't it save Warhammer Fantasy in the long run? The problem was, this was much earlier than the end times, and unfortunately, it was very inconsistent. The timelines were all over the place for Warhammer Fantasy, which meant that people couldn't really follow along. We could have easily had something to do with the Great War against Chaos. Now we do, at least. So from a story point of view, this might be the perfect time for you to jump in. There's not a lot of novels set in the Great War, but there is this video game and a few others. Campaign-wise, it did feel like a bit of an adventure because you had access to a campaign map, you would go to different locations, sometimes stop in rest points where you'd be able to buy new troops, get upgrades. It really did feel like the progression was coming in. And it was great, especially once you started hitting some divergences. This also meant that you wanted to scope through the maps and kill stuff just to make sure that you picked up as much gold as possible, because that way you'd be able to get the better troops. Early on, of course, you'd have kind of garbage troopers, and you couldn't bring them all in. You'd in fact get more and more options, and then obviously larger armies as the campaign went through, but don't expect to just spam constant marauders. It was kind of cool, because it meant you had to kind of plan ahead. Bring all your main troops and kind of risk them all dying, or bring some good ones, bring some chaff, see what you can do. Sacrificial lambs, if you will. Things would get really interesting as the story progressed, because obviously you'd get more troopers. For example, with the Chaos campaign, you'd have your Chaos army, but then also access to some Skaven through a Skaven army, meaning that you could play around with loads of different loadouts. This is what made it quite cool, because this meant that you were going through a campaign for a specific alignment, but also allowed to explore, so it didn't all feel the same. You weren't using all the same units all the time. This game had multiple types of battles, from your basic skirmish to siege battles, which were fairly decent, depending on how you moved your camera controls. It was very dependent on that, to also essentially what is now the domination mode for Total War Warhammer 3. It's really funny going back to that. The siege battles were very basic in the style of very early Total War games. So you'd fight your way into a city. There was just like 3 maps really for the skirmish mode, because there was a decent amount of maps for skirmish, but it was very split up. And yeah, push your way in, take the central point, you win, right? very much like older Total War games. Now you have to like dance around different control points, and sometimes it was just easier to kill the whole army, which you can do here too. Whereas the second mode was control points, and that was how you'd be able to generate income. Through that income, you'd be able to buy units and upgrades. Again, similar to survival battles and other formats of stuff, which was cool. You know, this was likely what inspired the survival battles for Total War Warhammer, which isn't a bad thing in any stretch of the word, because at the end of the day, you know, this isn't really getting used again, and it's cool to see inspiration from other Warhammer games come into that. This is an assumption of mine, but I assume it's probably the case. I would argue that barring the outdated graphics and controls, this game was really ahead of its time, and it's a shame that we didn't really get more to it, especially as a lot could have been done. I mean, the odd thing, of course, was going at the end of the Great War, where I feel the campaign could have been done very well between and during the Great War too. I didn't play a lot of the PvP stuff. I know that it was semi-popular, but keep in mind, around that time, it was also the big push from Warcraft 3, and a lot of people were jumping into that. Battle.net was so popular. Warhammer games could not compete with the behemoth that Warcraft was, essentially, or StarCraft, even in that case. But the battles were satisfying for the gameplay that it was at the time, and it was very thorough, because not only did you have certain factions to play around with, but you had the subdivisions into that. If you were playing as Chaos, you had Undivided, Khorne, or Nurgle. If you played as a Skaven, you had Eshin or Skryre. Some units were available to some factions, some were not for others, alongside mercenary units that you could pick up, meaning that if you were Chaos, for example, you could pick up some giants, you could pick up some orcs, goblins too. That stuff was really, really cool and so ahead of its time. The big push was always its narrative, and I would say that if you are a narrative fan only, you'd want to check that out purely for what lore there might be there. Now, it's important to keep in mind that obviously, since we are going into the Great War, and I imagine that afterwards, like they've done for 30k, where they progress after that, a lot of this stuff might not be canon anymore, but it will give you some basic knowledge of certain things. Like, for example, a lot of people are wondering for the old world why the Skaven aren't considered a core faction, and it's because the Skaven are mostly destroyed. They're rebuilding their numbers, and around the time of the Great War is when they became active once again. Same thing with the Dark Elves. Near the end of the Great War is when they started becoming more active, launching invasions of Ulthuan because Tyrion and Teclis were too busy on the mainland. So this stuff is all really good context. If you haven't played this before, I'd highly recommend it. It's around £12.50, I think, on Steam. It's also available on Good Old Games. The story is great. The cinematic, obviously, a lot of people remember that one. Buying it also gives you the expansion because it's all been packaged together, which is fantastic. This means that you just get so much more content. Like I said, don't expect another Total War Warhammer, but expect a good story. It's fairly well written. Maybe that will inspire you if you've been thinking about the old world, what army you might want to play. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a bit of a discussion. I do apologize for late videos lately. Feels like I'm coming down with something, probably seasonal flu. So yeah, I'm just working a little slow at the moment. Have a good one, guys. I'll see you all again very, very soon. Bye.